monsters trapped in the corridors. Be still, and give up your spirits. They don't belong to you. For most of you, I believe there is peace, and perhaps more, waiting for you after the smoke clears. Although for one of you, the darkest pit of hell has opened to swallow you whole. So don't keep the devil waiting, friend.
Ultimate Custom Night. Originally an expansion to Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator turned into his own game, where you're left to customize your hell with over 50 characters to tamper with at your disposal. Now, what appears to be disconnected from the story at first doesn't really last too long when you finally beat a high enough score to unlock a cutscene, or even dying enough to start picking up on the oddly Pacific voice lines spoken towards the player.
We've only just begun. I will never let you leave. I will never let you rest.
This is how it feels, and you get to experience it over and over and over again, forever. I will never let you leave.
He tried to release you. He tried to release us. But I'm not gonna let that happen. I will hold you here. I will keep you here, no matter how many times they burn us.
This is a nightmare that you won't wake from.
I have seen him, the one you shouldn't have killed.
There's something a lot more sinister at play here. Two different sets of cutscenes are shown to us: Toy Chica's high school years and Bear of Vengeance. The solution to how you understand what these cutscenes are meant to represent is how you interpret what they're trying to tell you. If we are going with the idea that this is Afton in Purgatory, then these cutscenes are meant to most likely reflect aspects of the storytelling we've seen about this character and his actions by showing us it from a new perspective. Toy Chica's high school years, showing how Afton had lured the MCI victims, even making a reference to Susie's dog, and we collectively start seeing a piece of their bodies collecting in Toy Chica's bag, ending up with a total of 7 victims by the end of it. If you count how many items are present in the bag, which accounts for all of the MCI, most likely Charlie, and an unknown 7th victim represented by Foxy's hook. Bear of Vengeance, on the other hand, isn't quite as easy to really conclude what it represents. However, since I'm going under the idea that this is probably related to Afton, and as someone who has been trying to constantly stop him, this is most likely meant to represent William versus Cassidy. William being represented by the fox, and Cassidy being represented by the bear. The fox doing everything in his power to make a fool of the bear, and his constant attempts to stop the fox, while the bear's main goal is to seek vengeance on the fox. There's other theories about it representing William versus Henry, or Michael versus the crying child, or even including a version where it's the 7th secret victim, which I'll get into later. But when it comes to looking at the other elements introduced in UCN, especially with Fredbear being present in the game, Old Man Consequences appearing as well, telling someone to leave Afton to his demons and to rest their soul, but also the 50-20 mode ending cutscene of Golden Freddy seen fading into the void. You'd think it'd be a pretty clear-cut case that this entire game is supposed to be a purgatory being run by the one you should not have killed, a Pacific victim of Afton's that is extremely vengeful enough to hold him hostage here in this never-ending hell. However, it's not that simple, or well, it is simple, but we get our answer from someplace else. If we were just going down the path where UCN is a purgatory being run by Toy Shank, which in this case would be Cassidy, this would ultimately be your solution. However, I don't think it is. In the Fazbear Frights story, the man in room 1280 is my counter argument to the debate. In the story of the man in room 1280, it follows a priest named Arthur, or also referred to as Father Blythe, who is called to Hercules Hospital in order to help a patient move on. However, this patient in particular isn't a normal patient. He was someone who's been on life support for years. Nurse Ackerman explained that he had no family and was taken off of life support by the state, but he wouldn't die. Arthur had seen this as a miracle. However, after reaching room 1280 and finally seeing the body, he described it smelling like burnt metal, smoldering plastic, and molten steel all at once, picking out disturbing odors of carbon and sulfur. Nurse Ackerman explained that he did indeed have brain function and pointed out jagged green lines playing out on the screen, representing the REM sleep pattern. This pattern indicated nightmares, horrific nightmares. The burnt body only vaguely represented a human, having a head, a torso, 2 arms, and 2 legs. Basically, a charred skeleton had remained. The fire damage could be seen throughout the body, having scorched away so many layers of skin, it looked like a translucent ashy covering on his body. Arthur continues to describe the body, even pointing out that it had no face, a hole in the skull where the nose used to be, and the dark pits lacking eyes and a toothless mouth gaped without lips. Arthur struggled to accept what he was looking at. Was he even a man? The brain function had suggested it was, but what determined humanity in life? The soul. Arthur finally entered the room and examined it, looking around. Eventually standing by a window, he felt something. An icy rawness bore a hole through the middle of his back. It felt so powerful that Arthur spun around, awkwardly reaching behind himself trying to rub his back. It felt like something was trying to reach into his soul. Nurse Ackerman asked if he felt it. Her and the two other nurses, Nurse Colton and Nurse Thomas, all nurses who worked in the hospice wing the longest, all had collectively agreed that this man was evil. However, it wasn't the body that was, it was what was inside of it. He asked her if that is what she was referring to, and she agreed, saying, "The doctors believe each lobe of this man's brain had 2 distinct electromagnetic signals. This is unheard of." Arthur asked what this meant, and she says that the doctors say they don't know, but they know. She says 2 signals means 2 living things, 2 entities. They're both vying for control of the brain, and that they're present in all of the lobes, but they're at odds with each other. We think they're tormenting each other. Nurse Ackerman leaves, and Arthur is left with this man alone. In response to Arthur telling himself to knock it off after questioning the man and how he was even alive, a reaction occurred from the monitors, a out-of-rhythm beep. After being shocked by what he was seeing, he tried continuing communication, saying that he would help the man, and after being scared by the man's hand moving while holding it, the man lifted it up and began writing out letters with his index finger, and Arthur realized this, telling the man to repeat the motion, ending up with a mess of letters that spelled out distribution center, unsure of what the other letters meant. One of the nurses, Nurse Thomas, accidentally said Fazbear Entertainment out loud, revealing what the other letters meant. From then on, Father Blythe's goal was to get the man to the distribution center throughout the remainder of the story. While the nurses are actively working to try and kill the man before Arthur can get the man out of the hospital, because they all agree he is pure evil and shouldn't be allowed to be alive. Mia, one of the nurses Father Blythe talked to at the beginning of the story, had talked to Arthur again after Arthur was getting ready to leave the hospital for the day, and asked about there being evil in the hospital. Arthur could tell she was trying to pry for something, but she gets interrupted as her boyfriend arrives to pick her up from the hospital. Arthur watched the sports car drive away, knowing he had a long battle ahead of him. He just hoped he was on the right side of it. Mia's second day started weirdly. She couldn't find the other nurses and made a round checking up on the hospice patients, until she noticed something odd with rooms in the hallways past room 1200 were all closed. However, the storage closet door was slightly open, and she quietly snuck up towards it and listened, hearing the word kill. It was the nurses going on about how they were justified in wanting to kill the man since he was evil. Nurse Ackerman mentioned how she needed morphine and they needed to act fast because Arthur was determined to get the man out of the hospital. The nurses agreed and Mia pushed off the wall, but she saw something. A little boy slithered out of the storage room, leaving sideways through the slim door opening. She tried to scream but stopped herself. She had the same reaction when she saw this boy just the day before. He had curly black hair and rosy cheeks, and the boy's face was covered by an alligator mask covering his forehead and eyes. Before Mia could answer her own question, the boy winked at her and scampered down the hall. Mia noticed the nurses were coming and rushed to room 1200. The man in the room asked what another word for hell was, and Mia answered quickly, saying shades. Unsure why, she had an answer on the tip of her tongue. Nurse Ackerman acquired enough morphine to enact her plan, but the mere thought of Father Blythe being so blind about what was going on angered her. Nurse Ackerman researched Fazbear Entertainment and she was alarmed by what she found. The distribution center was the central hub for all Fazbear related toys, costumes, and decor. It shipped to restaurants and specialty and retail stores. She looked at some of the toys and costumes and they were unsettling to say the least. Nurse Ackerman suspected that whatever was inside the man in room 1280 had a plan that needed to be stopped. She entered the room and injected the morphine into the IV, but nothing happened. Trying again with the second dose, she heard laughing this time. She stepped away from the bed and looked outside into the hallway and nothing. Then Nurse Ackerman heard another laugh, and this time it was behind her. A blast of cold rushed down her spine and tied it into a vice grip in her bowels. Not sure about what she was about to see, but she saw nothing. She pulled the rest of the vials out of her pockets, 11 more. She laid them on the edge of the bed in a tidy row, planning to inject them all if she had to. As she reached for the third vial, she heard the giggling again. This time, the giggle came from right next to her. A little black-haired boy stood by her side, looking up. He was grinning a grin so feral that it acted like a siphon, extracting the strength from Nurse Ackerman's limbs. Feeling the agony of she was living it, Nurse Ackerman experienced for the millionth time the moment when her son's death had reached into her heart and had torn it apart. She hadn't always been this way, but Elijah's death had carved her out. leaving a barely functional person to find a place among the living with reminders of the life she'd once shared with her son. She became a hospice nurse to help others who had to walk in her shoes. She snapped out of it. Nurse Ackerman pushed her past aside, along with the question of who the little boy was and why he was here. She reached for the vial, but a child-sized shadow flashed in front of her. As it streaked by, all the vials flew off the bed and shattered on the floor. Morphine puddled insidiously on the tiles. Her plan had failed. Now it was Nurse Thomas's plan, which worked for some time. Blood started to fill into the pillow, then it started to fill with a sickly green fluid. She gagged but kept pressing on. But that's when a shadow darted in front of Nurse Thomas and tore the pillow from her grasp. Before she could even think of retrieving the pillow, it ruptured, its contents ejecting into the room and all over her. Nurse Thomas didn't make a sound, but the monitors did. They shifted from a flat line into a steady rhythm. Nurse Thomas then fainted into the middle of the sickening mess on the floor. Now back to Arthur. He's still struggling to convince Hercules Hospital administration to let him take the man out of the hospital, and talks about the multiple sightings about the boy in an alligator mask being around the hospital. He said ultimately that wasn't really his problem and wanted to focus back on the man. But before that, he was having lunch with Mia today. They caught up outside and Mia mentioned how if Arthur kept bothering them enough, especially since they're busy, they'll eventually agree just to get rid of you. Mia laughed and bit into her sandwich again, but Arthur thought it wasn't a bad idea. Now back to the nurses. It was Nurse Colton's attempt now. She wanted to try injecting the man with air. It was lethal, simple, and sophisticated, just like Nurse Colton. On her way down to room 1280, she saw a boy running into the storage closet, but she just figured she'd deal with one mystery at a time. At the door of room 1280, she put her oil mixture above her upper lip to counter the smell, but the smell was still awful. This time, she was prepared to stop the spirit from interjecting, setting up candles in the room in a circle and lighting them. Then she looked at the man in the bed and said, "The room is filled with the light of good. No shadow can enter or do mischief here." She then faced the man head on and started injecting the air into the IV port, thinking she did it, but then the shadow quickly made sure she knew she failed, taking the syringe from her hand, spinning it just once before shooting it back at her like an air dart toward her throat. Stabbing deep into her skin, she pulled it out immediately knowing it would kill her, but then the spirit took it away from her again, surrendering this time. The syringe fell to the floor shattering, and a hot musty blast of air rushing through the room, extinguishing every candle flame and throwing them towards the wall. Nurse Colton had never had her intentions so violently defiled and she was rattled. Obviously, not showing it, she looked at the vile mass on the bed saying, "We'll find a way." Then a giggle came from outside the hallway. Nurse Colton rushed to the door and she ran right into Nurse Vermont, who stood like a statue, staring down the hall. Mia obviously wanted to know what was going on with the man in room 1280, and Nurse Colton noticed, explaining what was going on to her. Cutting back to Arthur, he did it. Mia's plan worked. Arthur got a call late that evening saying he could take the man in room 1280 to the Fazbear Entertainment Distribution Center if he signed multiple papers saying that he was responsible for what happens to the man. He arrived, signed the papers, and Mia waited outside to talk to him about the man. When Arthur finally exited the legal offices with the papers in hand, she tried to talk him out of taking the man, recognizing that the man had something in him that couldn't be let out, and saying that the nurses were right, but Arthur didn't budge.
Mia, I'm so sorry, but I have to take this man where he wants to go. It's his last request.
Just because it's his last request doesn't make it a good one.
Why is this so important to you?
Father Blythe asked. Mia had no logical answer. She knew how crazy it sounded, but beyond what she'd seen, all she had was a feeling, an institution.
It just is,
she said finally. Arthur put the papers under his arm and took Mia's hand.
Mia, I've lived long enough to see the kind of evil that exists in our world. I haven't seen it all by any means, but I've seen more than enough to understand that my glass is always full attitude has no basis in earthly reality. I should be jaded by now, I suppose. I should be pessimistic, ready to see the worst, but I'm not. I'm not because I choose not to let the past color the way I see the present. I choose to expect in every moment to find what's good.
But what if you don't?
Then there's always the next moment.
And what if there isn't?
Mia could hear the fear in her voice. She brushed away the tears that threatened to spill. Father Blythe breathed in and out slowly.
Then I'll move on to whatever my journey holds for me next, I suppose. That's all we can do. That's all I can do for the man in room 1280.
You won't change your mind.
I'm sorry, but no.
Mia stood. Father Blythe gathered his things.
May I hug you, Father?
Of course.
They hugged, and she tried to pour into Father Blythe the inexplicably huge amount of warmth she had for him. Or was it worry? They separated, and he said,
"Bye, Mia. I'll see you again soon."
Bye, Father.
She said as he gave her a little wave and headed down the hall. The Fazbear Entertainment Distribution Center was a massive collection of reddish and whitish buildings that Arthur could believe he had never noticed, looking like a long flat metal-sided blocks haphazardly placed in clusters by a gargantuan child. The buildings must have been here for at least 20 years. Arthur looked into the back of the van, seeing the man filled with blood and black fluids soaking through the sheets around the man. He asked where he wanted to go, and the man lifted his crusty finger bones, pointing towards the largest building in the Fazbear collection. Arthur drives in through a side entrance, finding a loading dock and taking the man inside the building. Arthur pointed out the workers in the building, then said,
"Well, here we are."
Arthur turned to look at the man, and then the man started to convulse. Several thoughts tangled in Arthur's head as he watched the bones and organs and tissues in the wheelchair started to shake uncontrollably. The man's rib cage cracked and blood flew, and tissue cinder began spewing. Arthur started to question his actions. At a loss, Arthur tried to pray, but before he could, the man's remains heavied, then bursted like a nightmarish egg, blowing open to disgorge new life, expelling rank-smelling, sticky black blood and tar-like substance in a frightful spray all over Arthur and the building floor. The explosion of bone and veins and organs happened in an instant. As he cleaned himself up, he saw the man's body tumble from the wheelchair. He knew he was dead. Arthur began praying again, but he heard a rush of pattering footsteps. What was that? Arthur wiped his eyes again. At first, all he saw was the man's remains. Then Arthur's gaze landed on a trail of tiny footprints that scampered in the man's charred blood and fluids. He followed the trail and saw the footprints continue away from the man, etching the floor in the man's blood like fearful hieroglyphs marking the way. The way to where? The man had moved on, but something didn't. "Father, is everything okay?" A man's voice, pitched high in shock, asked Arthur. Arthur turned. Arthur said for the first time in his life,
"Actually, no. I don't think everything is okay."
He was sure of it. The Man in Room 1280 is the sequel story to FFPS and the explanation for why UCN is even happening in the first place, and is part of a bigger finale that is seen directly in the Fazbear Frights books, connecting multiple different short stories into the Stitch Rate Stingers, which ultimately ties everything up for good, allowing everything in the original storyline to have a conclusion, including Afton finally dying. Although the entire Fazbear Frights book debate is currently something still ongoing, and regardless of the short stories themselves are the definitive versions of the stories in the game's timeline, I think everything happening in them is most likely canon. The alligator mask kid mentioned multiple times in the story is Andrew, the one who is causing William Afton to experience horrific nightmares, and isn't exactly a hell or a purgatory, rather something the vengeful spirit made in order for Afton to suffer for eternity through nightmares, and is a character heavily expanded on and first introduced in the Stitch Rate Stingers. So let's look back at everything one more time. Cassidy and Andrew are both present in UCN. Andrew is the one who is keeping Afton from being able to move on, and while Cassidy does initially stick around, as shown in the Old Man Consequences encounter where she talks to Old Man Consequences, telling her to leave the demon to his demons, rest your soul. There's nothing else. As we hear Afton screaming in the background, she decides to drown herself, which would lead us to seeing the 49-20 mode Golden Freddy ending, where she is seen fading into the void, finally moving on. However, as for Andrew, he's keeping Afton's real burnt body alive for multiple years after FFPS, until Father Blythe comes around and helps Afton be able to escape Andrew's grasp, unleashing Afton back into the world because of him blowing up and spreading his agony via a sticky black blood tar-like substance. And although his body being fully destroyed now, that's an important thing to know. In the Fazbear Entertainment Distribution Center, and Father Blythe also seeing Andrew leaving footprints walking away from Afton's corpse after he explodes as well. As for the cutscenes in UCN, Toy Chica's high school years, as I stated earlier, is basically showing Afton his victims that he killed, along with showing now that there is indeed a 7th victim we haven't really paid much attention to or noticed. This is Andrew. The Bear of Vengeance cutscenes, although could also be Afton versus Andrew, Andrew is heavily represented through a alligator persona. So this ultimately leaves us, at least for me personally, William versus Cassidy being what's represented through these cutscenes, marking the conclusion to Ultimate Custom Night storyline. Now obviously with everything that seems to have a conclusion or answer, there's more questions that come up, especially with Cassidy, because she may have returned during the Mimic storyline, which brings up a whole other can of worms, or also just what happens next. Fortunately, I might be able to answer those questions, but that's for another time, and you'll just have to stay tuned.